Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Stephanie Bocardi. I am the Senior Director of Go-to-Market Excellence here at Optiv, and I'm going to be moderating this morning's discussion. So today, we're going to be discussing Managed Detection and Response, otherwise known as MDR, and the most effective ways to implement it into your organization. Managing and monitoring your security infrastructure has never been more challenging. Tool sprawl, talent shortages, limited budgets, and disconnected technology stacks are challenging even for the most experienced security teams. So in short, MDR isn't just a luxury, it's really a necessity. Our experts today will be sharing why it's vital to identify your organization's specific needs before you begin implementing an MDR solution. Why the best MDR solutions provide far more advanced capabilities than you may be considering, and why you should be planning not just for the initial risk, but where your organization is headed in the future. So speaking of experts, I have joining me today Marty McDonald, Principal Security Advisor at Optiv, and John Pelton, our Vice President of Managed Detection and Response at Optiv. So thank you both for joining. Before I open up the discussion, I would like to make note that we do have a Q&A, and please utilize that. We will be monitoring questions that come in, and we'll make sure that we address all of them towards the end of the conversation. So with that, I will open it up. And John, let's start with you. What are the most important elements of a successful threat detection and response strategy that organizations need to consider before they decide to implement?
Awesome. Really good question. And I think really before you can even think about which one, you really need to work on having that solid foundation. And that really needs to be focused around being proactive, not reactive. You need to really focus on that resilient security posture from the ground up. And I think probably number one would be thinking about threat intelligence, making that actionable, not just feeds. So let's be clear, like threat intelligence is not about just subscribing to a dozen feeds. It's actually about actionable intelligence, right? Data that's relevant to your industry, your geography, your vulnerabilities. And I think a strong MDR solution is really going to be one that can not only ingest that intelligence, but correlate it all together and make it actual operational, right? You need to know much more about than just what happened. You need to understand why it happened, who might be behind it, and potentially what they're going to do next. And I think when you focus on an MDR solution that's really focused around intelligence, you can get away from chasing alerts to get to a better spot by proactively hunting, knowing who the attackers are, what they're likely going to target, and then dialing in your MDR solution to be tuned for those specific threats. I think there's some other components as well, thinking through it, having forensic capabilities. Right, I think the most bang for your buck is going to be integrating EDR in there as well. But if they do get in and get past that initial line of defense, we always need to be thinking about defense in depth, and then starting to pick up on something like NDR. Like, are they trying to go? They're trying to leverage lateral movement. Are they actually past the perimeter? And at that point, finding a solution that really integrates well from a network perspective as well, so that you can find that lateral movement, command and control. Things along the lines of that nature, and having an MDR strategy that really is looking more than just the endpoint, I think, is really critical, and being able to have that type of insight to drive attackers out and really protect your environment.
Marty, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think the points John hit are spot on, and definitely the where we need to think beyond just logs often. Being able to see a bit more into the environment and knowing what's going on. There's been some conversations on Twitter lately about the 20-year-old security advice that nobody's still following, and is it really good advice if nobody's following after 20 years? But it covers a lot of those kind of same things. We don't know it's there, we can't protect it. So making sure you understand what you have and own.
Absolutely. Marty, I'd like to stick with you for a second. What does an organization need to consider regarding their own individual needs when assessing an MDR solution?
Yeah, so I think just continuing that thread I was just talking about, making sure you really understand where your own maturity level is and what level you want to try and get to. is really important. These are services and they have access to some of your things, but not all of your things. And so understanding when you do get an alert out of these systems, what are you going to do? Do you still have some level of a security operations center in your environment that's going to take the alerts and do something with them? Do you still have folks that are going to do threat hunting in a SIM in your environment alongside of your MDR provider? And then really just making sure we understand how all of our tools that we own today are going to integrate into that new MDR solution, and what good value we can get out of them, what use cases they can drive. And then I think really thinking through your risk profile. Some folks are okay with having a little bit more risk than others. And so making sure that your provider understands your risk tolerance levels, so that we can make sure that we're tuning alerts a little less, a little bit more, depending on where that risk threshold is for you. And if the whole point of the solution is to buy down a bunch of risk for you, then making sure that we understand that and are hitting those right use cases for you. And then looking at all those existing log sources. If we've got any kind of data pipeline management tools in the environment, those can really help, bring the integrations into the MDR solution a lot faster, being able to split your logs out so you have a second copy of them somewhere else, so that if you do decide in the future to bring it all back in-house or to look at a different tool or provider, it just makes that process a lot easier for you. And then the last thing I think I'll add there is, how much do you trust that MDR provider? They're potentially going to be using some level of machine learning and AI to help drive out the insights that you need. Do you trust that what the models that they have are good for you, or do you want to be able to inspect them a little bit more? And I think we've seen across the board there are different levels of trust us, or no, here's what we're doing, here's how we're doing it, this is why we're doing it this way. So just making sure you're understanding where your provider is going to fall on that spectrum, and that you're comfortable with what's happening there.
Yeah, a lot of really good points there. I really liked what you mentioned around kind of doing that evaluation of what you already have. From an MDR provider perspective, I don't think a good MDR service should require you to rip and replace everything. It should really be focused on enhancing what you already have deployed and integrating with your existing investments where possible to really maximize their value there. If you have to come in and rip out your EDR and your identity and your perimeter and your vulnerability to do kind of a purpose-built stack, that's very disruptive, right? And that's wasting a lot of investment and the time, not only the investment and the dollars in that technology, but in your people, your team that you've trained on all of those tools to configure them from a policy perspective. So really finding a provider that integrates well with you, with what you have, stitching all of that together to really drive those outcomes. And then you mentioned the data pipelining and management. I think that's also another great one where almost all organizations are going to be subject to some type of compliance or regulation there. It's non-negotiable for many. So whether it's PCI DSS or HIPAA or GDPR, can that provider help you meet some of those other requirements through logging, right? When you have the data pipelining tools, and this is something that we build native in our MDR services, we can send data to multiple different endpoints so that one, we can achieve those security outcomes for you, but you likely have other logging requirements. Can we send that to another more cost-effective storage medium to help you meet those compliance requirements as well, right? Or is this something where the MDR provider is only purpose-built on security, you don't get access to the logs, and then you can't fulfill those requirements, and then you need to purchase another SIM or data solution? That just becomes very, very expensive there. So I really like what you mentioned, but I think understanding kind of what they integrate well with, is that within my environment? Can I maximize my existing investment? And are those other business use cases with my data that I can also solve for this? That really drives some really good outcomes at a very cost-effective point. And then I'll just close on the AI component. Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing every solution now saying it's AI focused, it's ML focused, and it will understand all of the threats within your environment without you really needing to lift a finger. And that's really not the case. It's a great tool, but really understanding what your provider means when they're bringing that to table, right? Is it something that is helping accelerate humans from a natural language processing or data summarization perspective? Or is it some black box that they say it will bring all of those threats to the surface and false positives no more? It's handling all of that. I think we'll get there, but we're just not there yet. So as you're working with providers, take some time to really understand what they mean by leveraging AI and ML, how it's baked into the platform, and what value does it actually provide. Make sure that you're not getting too caught up in some of the smoke and mirrors that we see out there.
If AI is just helping you write a query, is it really helpful? Yes, but that seems to be the thing that most people are focused on right now, and not what our clients expect, which is some level of detection content and learning, and we're just not there yet.
Both of you touched upon this a little bit, but can you elaborate more on some of the advanced features and capabilities that organizations should consider when looking at MDR solutions?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at starting with that. So basic MDR, right? What's been out here for a couple of years, it's detecting and responding to common threats. It's foundational. We all need that. But I think to really change the game, we're going to need to be focused on more than just detection and response, right? It's a platform that has a number of insights that you can use. But when you can find a way to bridge that proactively with the reactive doing the actual detection response, I think that's where you're really going to start to see some game changers there. So, for example, something that we're seeing commonly developed now is deeper integration into vulnerability management and like CSPM type data, right? That will help you understand where are you actually vulnerable within your organization. And as these alerts are coming in, getting that just-in-time enrichment to see, is this host actually vulnerable to what those attackers are leveraging there? Is this an asset that's been considered critical, or who's that system owner there? Having all of that just-in-time information, I think, really empowers analysts to make better decisions as well as recommendations. So it gets past to just reacting to alerts. We can start looking at trending data and say, hey, we're seeing these exploit attempts, they're not being successful, but we can see that within your environment, you actually have quite a large exposure to these types of vulnerabilities. And then that can help from a prioritization perspective in terms of what is your IT teams actually focus on remediating those vulnerabilities. I think it's very common that we just get caught up in, hey, here's a CVE score. What we're hearing is a very high priority vulnerability. We want to eradicate it from the environment, but there's tens of thousands of them. When you can really pair MDR data and kind of the modeling of where we're seeing attackers attempt to exploit specifically within your environment, I really think that that's going to help from a prioritization perspective that will actually allow you to significantly reduce your risk there. So that's an area that I think really needs to be bridged and focused on, is combining vulnerability in that asset and enrichment data to better make decisions around how can you actually reduce your risk within your environment.
That enrichment piece is something we've been talking about for years, and it's something most folks always struggle with, is how do we get that integrated and keep it up to date? And so it's definitely a focus area for a lot of clients, and being able to bring in that enrichment data so it's not just the vulnerability, but I may also know who owns the asset and how to get in contact with them to find out maybe there are some additional compensating controls we didn't know about. Or if we take that system offline because it's being attacked and it is vulnerable, what does that cost the business? So the more of that enrichment data we can pull in, often the better and more actionable our alerts become.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've really started to take that change from just ingesting like syslog and matching threats and unusual behavior there. I think that we still need to do that. That's critical, but actually leveraging bidirectional enrichments so that as we're seeing things, that story can get much more robust. You can stop pivoting between so many different tools to get that full picture. And I think ultimately just speeds up the decision-making process, reducing your time to detect and respond there. So yeah, it's integration of that kind of asset and identity inventory into MDR, I think, is really going to be something that's going to create incredible benefits, instead of just continuously relying on only what I can see in the log data and trying to match all of that together.
Yeah.
John, you also mentioned, oh, go ahead, Marty.
Stephanie.
I was going to say, John, you also mentioned cost avoidance, right? And cost savings with taking an MDR type of approach versus maybe a traditional co-managed model. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think, especially over the last 6 or 7 years, has become very apparent. At the end of the day, you still do need very strong capabilities from a data ingestion, a parsing, just dealing with big data. And time again, we've seen organizations say, I need to log all of these things. So they just turn syslog on, or they set up the integration and they say, we're going to get the great insights out of this. That's awesome, right? More data is always better from a usability perspective. You just have more telemetry and insight. But a lot of times where we see that cause some negative benefits is it's always an afterthought. It's always, and we'll come back and clean some of this data up, or just send what we need after we actually what's in the data. And we rarely see that data cleaned up. And ultimately what that turns into is every 6 months, your provider, as many of these SIM providers now are cloud-based, they're going to come back to you to say, hey, we initially talked about 500 gigs a day. You're now sending 1.5 terabytes. Here's another $600,000 a year that we need from you annually to make up for all of this data ingest that wasn't initially scoped. And that many times is unbudgeted. So finding a provider that does have significant capabilities and has built tooling into their service to help control those costs, I think is absolutely critical. I mentioned that is something that we do. We have a data management, a data engineering tool in front of us. We have 60 engineers in our SOC that are certified on that tool. And that really helps us take what do we need for actual detections, what do we need for investigations, what do we need from a threat hunting perspective, and bring that into the platform. And then if there are additional use cases for that data, we can fork that off to another cheaper storage media. We could send that directly to an Azure storage blob or an S3 bucket or a Google Cloud bucket that you could own and set the retention on it to say, I have this unfiltered data for 20 years if I'd like. And it's much more cost effective than sending it into a platform with second search and all of the additional enrichment that we talked about. So it really helps control the cost when you find a provider that is willing to work with you on that and has those additional use cases so that you can send in more data, but it's not going to just continue to ramp the cost of the overall service up there. So find a provider that has those capabilities. It will allow you to stretch the buck much further than what we've historically seen and just log all of the things to a SIM and then you really pay for that later.
Not understanding what your use cases are and the logs you need for those always cost triple. What if you actually were looking at what you just need for those log sources and being able to write everything else somewhere else, like you said, John, at that lower cost of storage. And I think either side, whether it's MDR or SIM, having that secondary location of storage is always important, period, just because it buys you that cost reduction, but it also buys you that ability to switch tools in the future if you need to, and maintain the compliance that you need with those logs without having to figure out how to take petabytes of data out of one tool and get it into another, which almost never works. So having that secondary location, I think, is really, really critical.
Yeah, agreed. I think it also helps from just what's next, right? I mean, we've seen all of these platforms spin up and somebody's got the next latest and greatest, and then we're seeing things kind of shut down and migrate to other platforms. If you don't think about your overall data management strategy up front, every time that there's a platform switch or a change, 6 months time gone. Whereas if you've really focused on ensuring how you may need to use this data in the future and have that kind of one data control plane and all those strategies, I mean, that's something that you can then cut down that 6 months into 1 to 2 months. Just reduces a lot of friction there.
Absolutely.
Talking about the future and planning for the future, what are some of the questions that we advise our clients to ask or that we answer?
John, you want to take that one to start?
Yeah, I think cybersecurity isn't static, right? It's always evolving. It's a chess match. And I think that as you're looking at kind of what, from an MDR perspective and looking for a partner or provider there, it's not about just meeting today, but it's tomorrow, just as we talked about. So I do think that one area that we're going to continue to see reducing friction around is streamlining those workflows. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but figuring out how to better integrate what we're doing from a detection response perspective into IT remediation, right? Like finding out how can we reduce that friction between SecOps and IT. It's continuing to be a problem that remediation and disruption to an organization by remediating actual vulnerabilities, the IT team doesn't want to do that. They want to have incredibly high uptime and availability there, but security wants to make sure that it's something that we can ensure the environment is protected, and that sometimes creates disruption there. So finding ways to better integrate those processes and taking the outputs from an MDR service to use as input from a remediation perspective, I think is going to be key there. We need to kind of bring back IT and security back together. So I think we've kind of gone down two different paths there. And then I think also comes like data management. From a SOAR perspective, finding a provider that will actually integrate with your core tools and the case management systems there. I've been with Optiv for 10 years, all within our managed security services teams. And I think one of the number one complaints from a client perspective is when we work something in an MDR provider or MDR platform or a SIM platform, a lot of times those initial tools or detectors such as Defender or CrowdStrike or Sentinel-1, that case still looks like it's unacknowledged. So finding a way for an MDR provider to integrate back with those so that it can update those tools and close that out as being remediated. I see machine learning only leveraging kind of that metadata there to better their models. And if you find a provider that will actually integrate that information back into that, it's going to have much more rich data to improve those machine learning models there. Whereas if it's all one way, like you have these tools deployed, they just one way send data out, and the overall end outcome never makes its way back, it's not going to be able to learn from that data. So I think that that's definitely something that we need to think about as just better integration of all of the tools and the decisions. So just make sure everything talks well with each other, and you do have a clean point of view of what's actually in your environment, and ensure that things have just been worked at the end of the day.
I'll add on the people side of things there. I think that's a key area. It's a partnership. This isn't you buy a tool and set it and forget it. It's a partnership. The MDR providers are going to be sending things back into your environment that you need to do something with. And so making sure, like John was saying, that friction is lowered. We've built a virtual SOC. If we don't have a full SOC in our environment, we know when that type of alert comes in, who should be working it in our environment, are really, really critical pieces that we often don't see clients do well. I know I've talked to clients over many years, and no one's really ever happy with their SIM. And you start asking them questions about how are they using it, how many people do they have working on it, and it's always, well, we look at it once a week, and there's a halftime person, and that's just really not enough for these tools. They are platforms that require a lot of attention and care and feeding, and as good as they've gotten, as good as we've gotten at detecting things inside of them, often it's still a human looking at it and going, that's weird, and being curious and diving in a little deeper that actually finds the badness. And so we still need those curious humans involved and engaged, whether it's, like I said, in that virtual SOC kind of capability where we built out a nice racy matrix of who's responsible for what bits, and we've partnered together so that your MDR provider understands who they should be working with when it's that type of thing. Or we're just, otherwise we're opening cases and you're picking them up and running with them, but you may not have the context you need or understand the response procedure. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen on both sides still. And so I think that as you're thinking about the future and what you're going to get out of these tools, the more you're willing to partner, the more you're willing to put into the relationship, the better the tools are going to be for you.
And we'll just add a little bit more. Really like what you said about the most organizations don't have just the bench to put into a SIM, and it turns into shelfware at the end of the day. We obviously want to avoid that with how important all of this data is. But I think just forward looking, how much time do you actually have to invest in your analysts and your hunters or your engineers? Like, what training can you set them up to receive, and can you make sure that that's being focused on portions of their environment that will be beneficial long term, right? The last thing that we want to do is continue to expect security professionals to know everything under the sun and then continuing to do all of these tool changes, right? Like, it feels like every 18 months there's something new and groundbreaking come out that we need to learn. And now somebody who's already split 15 different ways, like there's another split again. Like a decade ago, Kubernetes wasn't a thing, but we need to know about those things. So ensuring that you are investing from a human perspective in your environment to protect the environment and allow a provider to handle most of that day to day so that you just don't get stretched too thin. I think that's really important. You want your employees focusing on policy and engineering the environment to be more resilient more robust, have a provider deal with all of those alerts and all of those investigation components. That creates a lot of curiosity and creates a lot of rabbit holes, and can be just really challenging, I think, to scale with that, especially with a smaller team.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to do a quick time check and just remind everybody, please go ahead and leverage the Q&A function. If you have a question, these guys are happy to jump in and answer. I did get one question. Let's see here. How are we at Optiv satisfying the varying compliance and log retention requirements across our client base or wide-ranging industry verticals?
Yeah.
So both of you touched on this when talking about understanding your use cases first and foremost, but if you could just elaborate, that would be great.
Yeah, just to kind of reinforce the point of having a provider that can do multiple things with your data, right? We want to be able to support those use cases, and every vertical, it's going to be a little bit different in terms of what you need to support, but having a provider that can be flexible in how the data is actually used, I think is absolutely critical there, right? Investing in that data management, that data pipelining area, so that yes, you can do everything you need from a security perspective, but then you have these large volumes of data that are very expensive from just a volume perspective, but maybe from a security perspective, it's not very usable. Not every bit and byte is valued the same to an organization from a security perspective. So pick what you need to drive security, and we will help you do that, and putting all of that security focused data in a security platform, and then everything else that you need to support those compliance requirements, as Marty said, send it to a different location. Maybe it could be a cheap instance that you're hosting. It could be an S3 bucket if you don't need significant access to it. Like, there's a lot of capabilities, and we really enjoy working with our clients to say, like, what do you actually need here? And then architecting a solution instead of just saying, yeah, we'll do everything for you, without actually digging for those requirements, right? That's ultimately going to create a lot of assumptions, and then expense normally comes to those assumptions that need to be passed on. So find a provider will do both.
And I think really paying attention to what the provider is bringing to the table from just that use case standpoint, so you understand what logs you need to send them. I think the industry as a whole is going to come to you and say, yes, we need these specifically, and then you're going to have some that are a little unique to you that we're going to work with you through. But just understanding what the provider's got in their tool bag to start with is really going to be critical there, and then figuring out what we need to send, what we need to ingest, and what we can put somewhere else, because it doesn't either have the right security context that we need for the use cases that we've built, or it is that compliance log that is just, we need it. We might need to search it once a year when the auditors come to town, but that's about it.
Another question in the chat as well, and I think this is actually a great question to end on. In your words, can each of you explain what you think the key differentiators are for Optiv's MDR solution in a highly competitive field?
Yeah, I'll start with that. From a key differentiator perspective, I think it's platforms that are focused around transparency, right? Extending the capability for an organization that we're providing services to access their data, to be able to search it, have that level of transparency, so that if they want to roll up their sleeves and be curious and work with their data, they have the capability of doing so. I think also we've talked about the data management component. That really does open up a lot of additional use cases, and reduces cost, and reduces the need to run a SIM in parallel to doing an MDR service, right? You don't want to have additional specialized tools that you ultimately don't need if your provider can check both of those boxes. And I think the third component is integration with other tools within your environment, being more of an open ecosystem, not being a closed wall, like you have to have the same vendor for EDR and identity and vulnerability and perimeter. That creates vendor lock-in, that creates very expensive situations if you want to move away from that. Find a provider that will integrate with all of your existing investments to maximize those investments and actually integrate, right? Not an integration isn't just taking data in. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's updating those other cases, doing enrichment there, taking those supported response actions. That's really going to make your environment work together much better, and finding that provider to stitch all of that together instead of dictating to you, saying, you need to rip out everything you've done and use all of our stuff, right? I think that's really important from a differentiation perspective.
And I think I would add, the R portion of MDR is such a huge area that we probably don't focus on enough, but that ability for us to take some level of response action in your environment for you. Obviously, we're working with you to understand what those guardrails are and if we're authorized to do it for a specific user or machine, but being able to take those response actions is huge. And it's something I think a lot of clients are really looking for is they want to be a little bit more hands-off of the solution and let Optiv or others take care of it for them. And so I think our ability to do those response actions, whether it's on a malware event or bumping a user off the network because it looks like they're trying to do some insider risk type stuff, is really a huge thing that and some value that we're bringing to the table as a part of our out-of-the-box solution.
Awesome. Thank you both. I really appreciated the discussion. Thank you, everybody who joined us today. If you're interested in learning more about Optiv's MDR, please reach out to your Optiv account team. And with that, John, Marty, thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye all.